So to be honest with you, I had 3 different options for this talk and almost 30 pages of single-space text, and I experienced a lot of difficulty in trying to choose the point I really wanted to share with you here. In the end, I decided, or something decided for me, to share with you the sidetrack, the back alley, the waste, the cutoff, the story I would have kept aside, the main point I would normally try to make in a presentation. I think the central theme of this talk revolves around orientation and disorientation, around illumination and disillusions, around enthusiastic exploration and dead ends. Following what I understood from the invitation to talk here with you in this anti-conference, I will share a piece of my trajectory as a wannabe researcher to highlight and reflect on the profound changes in the ways of seeing things that the work of Dorothy Smith, through its enacting in interpersonal relations with some very fresh people in this room, has had on me. So here is a simple breadcrumb trail story for you. It is a series of small fragments. Fragment 1, suburb sadness, friendship, and naive revolt. I think it is mainly through the weirdest and richest encounters and friendships in my teenage that I slowly came to feel and intuit how criminal, morally revolting, and exploitative this fucked up world of ours is. I grew up in a middle-class suburb in the Montreal region. It was so boring and sad. My parents were sad, divorced corporate lawyers coming home sad and frustrated. In many ways, I was also so lucky, for sure. They were loving, and I was never hungry or cold. But anyhow, I was mostly hanging out with older people, half delinquents, because I felt there was something really lively about them. My friend Annick was maybe 6 years older than me. We had met at the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City in 2001 for that mind-blowing and historical, almost warlike demonstration against neoliberal free trade agreements between Canada, the USA, and Mexico. Annick was telling me stories about Sept-Îles, the aluminum factory town where she had grown up, a town where her father was, excuse me for the graphic language, beating up her mother in their humble bungalow, where her brother had committed suicide, where she had been hooked on drugs like PCP, dropping out from school, working at McDonald's, and fleeing racist baseball bat fights between white teenagers and First Nation kids. In other words, just normal lives, institutionally fashioned and engineered Canadian lives of the late 1990s. She was really something, Annick. She knew so much. No wonder she didn't want to go back home. Sadly, I've lost contact with Annick for years now, but to this day, I still thank the meanderings of the existence that made me become her friend. It is mainly, I think, through friendships like this one that I felt and confusedly realized how the world I was in was grotesquely oppressive, so brutal and disorienting. Fragment 2, turning to philosophy. As so many other kids with my profile, I prioritized questioning this whole existential mess rather than indulging in it. And I guess that is how for my undergraduate studies, I chose to explore the disciplines of philosophy and sociology. More precisely, I devoured critical theory works. Marx, Gramsci, Lukács, Adorno, Marcuse, Habermas, yes, mostly old white dudes. This was a time of my life when I was also engaged in student political organizing actions like strikes. This was also a time of great intellectual and spiritual experiences. I remember getting out of conversations with friends or stepping out of a seminar room and being completely shaken and blown away by some new theory and ideas. It was highly stimulating. But after a while, I became increasingly dissatisfied with what I came to diagnose as a very problematic divide between critical philosophy's content and pretensions as an emancipatory force, and the fact that this sphere or field of activity was in fact mainly confined to university departments producing the next generations of the professional managerial class. I noticed how a lot of people were simply graduating, then finding a job in an institutional space already defined and compatible with the relations of ruling they had been studying. I was myself dissatisfied, naively most probably, with just getting a job that was not directly inspired by a form of praxis, which means something like an active kind of engagement, a highly relational form of thinking and doing explicitly engaged in addressing forms of oppression through consciousness raising and action. Fragment 3, turning to nonprofit work. Long story short, that is how I began working for a medium-sized nonprofit organization based in Montreal. This organization was working with people facing issues such as homelessness, employment precarity, immigration, or the Canadian colonial legacy. There, along a team of 20 other facilitators like me, I became a kind of political, popular educator and community mobilizer. For example, I was facilitating series of workshops with and for people using homelessness shelters or day drop-in. And these workshops were mixing experiential techniques from the arts, such as forum theater, with techniques and content from philosophy like communities of inquiry. The output of such processes were things like zines, videos, podcasts, in which people were producing an analysis of the common challenges they were facing. At other times, people were also choosing to work on topics that were not directly related to their own existence. One time, for example, they chose to create a mini exhibition assembling paintings from different revolutions: the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, etc. Here again, I will always remember the vivid and exhilarating moments of truth I feel like I have had the chance to share with so many people. Progressively in this organization, I was pushed to endorse managerial roles along my practitioner's activity. And after 2 or 3 years, I soon realized that the outcomes of the work we were doing with people were quite interesting in terms of symbolic impacts, breaking stigmas, raising consciousness, etc. But in terms of improving and challenging their dire life conditions, this work was extremely limited. Not only limited, I often felt like it was complicit in how the homelessness sector was functioning. We were contributing to the creation of spaces where people could have ephemeral, meaningful moments as thinkers and creators, but in terms of praxis, in terms of talking back to the oppressive forces, the outcomes of our work was very docile, very obedient to the overall industry of managing the social misery. There again, I grew very disillusioned and unsatisfied. Even more so considering that this organization was presenting itself as a social innovation agency. We had internal documents such as theories of change or theories of social transformation. In terms of dominant discursive practices, the organization was also dismissive of many of the more traditional principles of grassroots organizing, such as having a board composed of members with lived experience, or such as having a quite flat internal hierarchy. In line with this, my bosses were strangely uncritical of the philanthropic funding and associated textual and discursive operators we depended on. They were also uncritical of the impact evaluation frameworks designed pro bono by the multinational consulting firm KPMG. Moreover, this organization had a weird hybrid model and organizational culture, which is quite representative of an emerging trend. It was inspired by some concepts from social innovation, social entrepreneurship, social finance. It had a little fishy something of a nonprofit startup mixed with grassroots organizing tones. Looking at it retrospectively, this was in good part due to the funding and accountability regimes, again, that the organization depended on. This organization was in fact completely hooked on social innovation seeding money, so its objectives were always focused on the development or innovation of new ways of addressing of addressing standard funding targets such as school perseverance, social mixity in public spaces, crime prevention in the homelessness population, pre-employment skills building for kids in poor neighborhoods, etc. So this kind of conceptual backbone of all this work, the kind of overall coordinating assumption and expectation, was that we were trying to invent new community and social services, new ways of addressing social problems, new ways of trying to fix social systems. But in the actualities of our everyday work, underneath this thick rhetorical layer, I was witnessing again and again how the organization was caught up in operationalization issues, in managerial and logistic issues, applying for new funds, reporting, inventing new programs in a rush and without evidence, hiring new staff, creating partnerships with new organizations, and so on. I was also noticing how limited our collective ability to really assess and respond to the needs of participants and community folks was. How can I claim to be innovative if I can't even properly connect and align my actions with the needs of people I work with? My coworkers often pretended, myself too, to have a clear understanding of why they were doing what they were doing and of where they were going. In other words, they could hang on to the organizational scripts and discourses that were in fact, as my institutional history work revealed at some point, coming from years of applying for funding and internalizing, too often uncritically, funders' buzzwords and fundable metrics and outcomes. But all of these bullshit flags didn't seem so important because all the partners and funders and board members and volunteers around the organization were praising its work because some of its work was maybe something. In all of this, at some point, I paused and I wondered, in what kind of wrapped zone have I been trapped in? What kind of meteorological system of the consciousness have I been blown into? This was an experience of, as we were discussing this morning, double consciousness or bifurcation of consciousness. This situation of mine appeared to me particularly ironical, considering that I had been so engaged in critical theory, grand theories for enabling the dismantling of the social relations within the capitalist political economy, very fancy philosophical theories, to dismantle the pervasive and pernicious forms of bourgeois consciousness. So ironical also because my master's thesis was about Adorno's diagnosis of the crisis of experience in modernity. I really felt like I had lost my way. I was then acknowledging the extent to which all this theory I had been reading didn't provide the kind of pragmatic political imagination and know-how needed in such circumstances. I felt disoriented, not knowing exactly where to turn to in this conundrum of thinking and doing. I knew I needed to find some sort of reference points, some landmarks, a new kind of orientation trick. Fragment 4, turning to institutional ethnography. So I decided to take a step back and embark on what kind of step is that, a PhD journey, to take some time to reflect on those series of conundrum. That is when I first got acquainted with the work of Dorothy Smith. It was really transformative indeed for me on many levels, and I think I'm just starting to realize how and why. One thing it really changed for me was that it helped me break the spell of grand theory as I had known it. It furthered my thinking about how the small nitty-gritty details of our everyday lives and nights are in fact weaved into the fabric of our globalized political economy. I think it freed me from the compulsion to see social science as being about the act of revealing the fundamental and generalized rules of how the social life is put together. It showed me that it can be legitimate to start looking up into the relations of ruling in which we participate from where we are already situated. That was far from obvious for me, even though I was very engaged in critical theory. In fact, putting forward a putting forward or traversing such reflexivity is, I now believe, a necessity in order to really engage in emancipatory and solidarity-driven relationships with others. In IE terms, what I'm talking about here touches the concepts of the standpoint and the starting point of the inquiry. Before reading Smith and working with Naomi, I would never have felt legitimate, or I would never have deemed this kind of content I have been exposing to you as worth being part of a research journey. For a long time, I was discarding the relevance and legitimacy of such a subjective way of grounding and framing the research problematic. The writing of Dorothy Smith have greatly helped me see how these experiences, discomforts, and twisted discourses and split consciousness regimes of mine could be progressively used as fuel for research. If you allow me a psychoanalytic metaphor, her work has allowed me to let some unconscious forces come out to consciousness. It allowed me to perceive the objective and generalized element in what seemed only my trivial and individual failures. Typical of academic norms, I was repressing or disqualifying these experiential underpinnings as unworthy. Her work showed me how to reverse the hierarchy of values according to which things of the main business, she uses this term, are more important than localized and anecdotal experiences. And retrospectively, I now feel like this was, at least for me, a necessary gateway, humbly. A second main aspect of my thinking, what time am I in? No? Okay. So if it's boring, you tell me and then I stop. What? Cool. A second main aspect of my thinking that was transformed through my encounter with IE relates to the concept of ruling relations. There is a lot to be said about that concept, and my goal is not to define it here in detail. To me, it was compelling because of the specific way it was offering a materialist take on concepts such as ideology, power, and governmentality. It was kind of combining Marx's materialism with Walter Benjamin's idea that history should be looked at from the perspective of its victims, and adding onto this the Foucauldian insights on discourse. Not only was she offering a way of binding those together, but she was also doing it in an accessible and pragmatic way that was quite applicable in the context of my practice. Let me give you an example of a context where it made sense for me. I worked with Inuit people on the setting up of a professional development organization for employees of local social and community services. The overall aim of the project was to foster school perseverance in the community. So Inuit employees would take facilitation training or project management training and so on, and thus increase their ability for collaboration among services and multiply the opportunities for kids in the village to take part in fun and interesting activities that were helping them develop things like self-esteem, literacy, critical thinking skills, and so on. Once this project was set up and running, it became increasingly clear that it was not challenging very much the colonial order which the Inuit were problematizing. One example of this of the colonial order being the fact that most teachers in school were white settlers from the South who, beyond their good intentions, often carried problematic prejudices such as thinking that bad parenting skills were caused by alcohol abuse. This project was supposedly very innovative, again, in the ways it was targeting school perseverance from outside the school, and it was providing some much-needed access to training and also educational activities for youth, but it was not in fact challenging the relations of ruling that overpowered people's lives in the community. Funders were funding the project as such, a project focused on improving the behaviors of parents and kids regarding school perseverance. That is the time when I started reading Smith. While discussing with my Inuit colleagues, I realized we were not looking at the project through the prism of the ruling relations. In good part, that was because of the funding and accountability aspects of it, which is to say the texts that had initiated it and that had thus shaped our way of seeing. Furthering this thinking, we created trainings for the teachers in order to create exchanges between them and the parents, and thus try to raise consciousness about the colonial legacy and the way that they were teaching kids. I skipped the many tensions we encountered in trying to do this, but this initiative of analyzing collectively the structure of the learning environment in the community and targeting actions we could do regarding the different ruling relations was also very stimulating for my colleagues who were suddenly seeing so many different possibilities. We also tried a series of interviews with kids about their experiences as learners. This in turn informed the training of the employee in other community services like the arena, the youth house, the family center. This was very different from directing our attention to improving the educational quality of the activities and educational competencies of the employees, which was what the funders and the other organizations were in fact expecting from this project. This project had become about identifying and transforming the relations of power that were affecting the community as a global environment for the kids to learn and flourish. So it meant engaging nurses and doctors and municipal employees in the conversation and so on. It was again a time of excitement because we felt like we could orient ourselves on what really mattered. Excitement also because of the feeling that this way of seeing was opening hope and possibilities that were not as obvious before, pragmatic possibilities in the small things, one small thing after the other. But after a while, in fact, after some months only, funders started questioning the relevance of this approach. Other organizations in the community considered this work to be insufficiently focused on educational targets. And through conversations with my coworkers, I realized that the initial excitement about the possibilities had turned into a feeling of being overwhelmed by all these relations of power. Disillusionment and helplessness in front of the task took over. Fragment 5, the conclusion, sitting with this in lieu of a conclusion. So from this anecdote, I retain this very simple idea. Mapping the ruling relations is certainly a necessary, challenging, and fascinating task. You feel like you have the collective power of uncovering some valuable ephemeral truth and actionable knowledge. But doing something about the problem on the basis of this mapping is even more challenging. In our positions as researchers, we should never forget this insight, as simple as it is, because I think it impacts the ways we relate with the practice side of things. Another important point for the reflection here regarding this tension is that I have always felt a kind of discomfort regarding the fact that in practice, even though the IE inquiry is structured in a situated standpoint and problematic, the exploration of the ruling relations remains the privilege of the researcher. Even in a participatory process, the mobility of exploring, the time and resources to do it, remains mostly possible for the researcher and not so much for the practitioner. And I have noticed how this asymmetry of knowledge can actually impact the collective dynamic in a project like the one I was describing. And that is a point I look forward to discussing with you in this anti-conference. This directly connects, and that's the final sentence, with the question of the pragmatics of making change from below that Smith and Griffith raised in the last chapter of their last book. They talked about, quote, potential for IE that is not perhaps fully recognized as having a distinctive significance for the research we do. As we've shown, problems people actually experience are of major importance for research directions, but a move towards discoveries of how changes can be made is a bold step forward and needs to be more adequately recognized for its value to our field, end quote. Thank you very much.